Welcome to The Economist Next Door, a podcast where we make complex economic ideas accessible. No PhD required.
Markets confer agency on individuals, but also demand agency from individuals as well. It is a more reflective mirror of what human beings are meant to be. In other words, markets better reflect what you might call our anthropology, who we are as human persons.
In today's episode, I talk with Samuel Gregg, president of the American Institute for Economic Research and the Friedrich Hayek Chair in Economics and Economic History, to talk about why today's economic debates are no longer just technical and why defending free markets requires making a moral human case, not just an economic one. Let's get started. Welcome to The Economist Next Door, an economics podcast for everyone. My name is Paul Mueller. I'm a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. This podcast, The Economist Next Door, is sponsored by the American Institute for Economic Research, which we sometimes call AIER. And AIER, which we'll be talking about today, is a think tank, a research institution committed to free markets, limited government, and sound money. We're an educational institution that focuses primarily on reaching informed citizens about policy and news issues of the day. We also talk with policymakers, sometimes at the state level, sometimes at the federal level. We work with academics in different universities and colleges. We work with other research organizations. And we also have student programming who come and participate in seminars or internship programs with us. So we are an educational program focused on economic freedom, free society, and human flourishing. Now, some of you may have listened to the podcast E-Conception with Dominic Pino. Dominic worked at National Review and created that podcast in partnership with AIER. He would often have a guest each episode to discuss some topic, and then he would also comment on other public policy issues using sound economic theory, or what we like to call the economic way of thinking. Now, Dominic was hired by the Washington Post late last year to help run their economics editorial page, a clear sign of his talents and a big success for him and for those who want to advance and champion free markets. But he was unable to continue producing E-Conception given the new role. So AIER leadership decided to reimagine what that podcast could be, and they invited me to come and host it. I'm a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. Before that, I was a professor of economics at the King's College in Manhattan for almost a decade. I completed my PhD and master's degree in economics at George Mason University. I was an undergraduate at Hillsdale College. And I'm also a research fellow with the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy, where I work on some religious liberty issues. I live in a small town in the mountains of Colorado where I own and run a bed and breakfast with my wife and 6 children. And I'm excited to be launching this podcast, hosting this podcast. We want it to be something where people can tune in, and maybe they haven't had very many economics classes. Maybe they are not following the news in detail every day or public policy issues. I see myself as a little bit of a bridge between sort of ordinary people who are going about their lives and policy people and research people who spend their time in spreadsheets and data and the Wall Street Journal. And you're welcome to listen in. That's what we hope you will come and join for. This podcast, we're going to be talking about policy and news at various points, but we're not going to be slaves to the news cycle. So we're not going to talk about what came out in the newspaper this morning, but rather we want to comment on big picture issues or topics of concern for ordinary people, and then connect that to deeper principles of economics, of philosophy, of history. And I should also mention, again, both as an organization and this podcast, we're very nonpartisan. We don't have a political agenda here. We're not Team Red or Team Blue. We're going to call balls and strikes and just talk about the economics and the philosophy and the principles behind public policy issues or stories or how the economy is developing. So thank you for joining us on this journey. And with that, I'd like to welcome the president of the American Institute for Economic Research, Sam Gregg. Now, Sam wears a lot of hats here. So he's the president. He also leads my research team, which is called Defending Freedom, Combating Collectivism, which is a mouthful. We'll talk about why we call it that later and what we do. He also leads sort of the overall research team at AIER. So he is doing kind of triple duty here with several different roles. Before he joined AIER, he was at the Accident Institute for many years. For those of you who don't know Sam, he's written about markets and public policy for a while. But even before that, he's written books about the American founding, about natural law, and a variety of other topics. With that, I'll let Sam fill in any of the gaps in what I've just said. But Sam, thank you for joining me today for this first episode of The Economist Next Door.
Thank you, Paul. It's great to be with you. I'm very pleased that we're doing The Economist Next Door as a podcast because I think there's a lot of podcasts out there, but there's not one that quite does, I think, what this one aims to do, which is essentially to bring complicated economic ideas to bear upon the present, but in a way that is easy to comprehend. I think there's a tendency for people who work in the world of economics and political economy to talk to themselves, to use a lot of jargon. But one of the things that AIER exists to is talk to what we like to call the everyman and the everywoman, people who are interested in economic ideas, questions of political economy, but don't have the luxury of people like you and myself and thinking about these things 24/7. So I hope that this podcast will be one in which we'll be able to bring greater economic clarity to many of the contemporary short-term, medium, but also long-term questions that are facing the United States and the American economy, because in that regard, we certainly live in interesting times indeed.
We do. There's all kinds of reports and data and studies that we look at in our day to day that are important to grapple with and understand. In the work you've been doing recently, whether it's in your most recent book or other things you've been writing, you maybe have an example of something that people have been spared not having to read, but you can summarize the takeaways from a study or things you've had to read to form an opinion about something that matters when it comes to where we are currently in the economy or with public policy.
We are, as a country, in a major debate about questions of trade right now, particularly the argument that's going on about the respective merits of free trade and trade liberalization, as opposed to the position of protectionists and protectionism. And this is complicated by the fact that we're also entering, and I think we've been in for a while now, a move away from what many people described as rules-based international order. And we're going back to old-fashioned geopolitics. I'm not sure we ever left the old-fashioned geopolitics at all, but nonetheless, that is a major complication for any discussion of trade these days, because trade and foreign policy are things that are very difficult to separate out from each other. And if you read people like you mentioned, Adam Smith, he makes it very clear that these issues are very difficult to separate out from one another. One of the things that we have done at AIER over the past 3 years is to focus very directly upon these types of questions concerning trade and its implications for geopolitics and the way that geopolitics is shaping trade policy. And that involves reading not just a lot of economic literature, but it also involves reading a fair amount of foreign policy theory. There's theories behind all this. This stuff just doesn't happen in a type of intellectual vacuum. So if you read some of the papers, the white papers that AIER has been putting out since 2024, you'll find, I think, some pretty sophisticated, but nonetheless clearly written articles and analyses of this particular question. Because it's one thing, as I often say, to win the economic argument about free trade, and I and AIER were unabashed free traders. But you also need to make that argument in the context of some of the geopolitical realities that we're surrounded by. So I like to think that our white papers on this subject and lots of other things that we've written on this subject, whether it's op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, whether it's pieces in publications like National Review, or even some of our staff appearing on media such as CNBC and Fox News, that we've been able to introduce some clarity into this very complicated topic that has major economic implications for the United States as an economy, as a nation, but also has some major implications for the domestic economy and some of the political debates that are going on right now.
And I think what you highlighted in terms of the role of ideas or theories behind what people say and do is often underappreciated. I can't remember the exact quote of John Maynard Keynes, who's a famous economist that we criticize extensively, but he made this comment a number of years ago saying something to the effect of politicians, leaders who think that they're pulling ideas out of the air or they're novel or new or revolutionary are actually just following the ideas of some, I think he uses the phrase defunct economists, right? And I think that's true in our day. I listen to some of the more populist rhetoric coming from the right, whether it's someone like a Tucker Carlson or other kinds of figures who are very down on economics or economic theory, think that economists got it wrong, and they have this different view of the world. But as you point out, there's history and theory behind even protectionism or mercantilism or national defense. And so, where I'm going with this, and what I'd like you to comment on, is maybe share a little bit about. So, you talked about how we're doing that now, but maybe a little bit about AIER's history, just briefly, and how AIER was formed in many ways to counter bad theory or bad ideas with better ideas, with analysis, with careful analysis and explanation.
Yes, so Keynes wrote that quotation that you just referred to in the last pages of his general theory, which, whether one agrees with it or not, is a very important text which came out in 1936, and it basically changed economics as a discipline. I would argue not for the good, generally for the bad, but nonetheless, Keynes made the point. He said the line was something like, ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. So, in other words, abstract economic theories that people like you and I think about and write about and try to explain to people, Keynes's point was that's where you have to win some of the fundamental arguments. If you want to shape policy, if you want to change the destiny of countries, you need to engage in win those deeper theoretical economic arguments.
Mm,
And this was understood by the founder of AIER, which was set up in 1933 by Colonel Edward Harwood, because when he saw what the New Deal was likely to entail for the United States, when he started to see the drift away from what you or I would call basic free market assumptions about the nature of economics as a whole, but also the policy implications of that, when he saw that all disappearing, he came to the conclusion that these ideas needed to be combated at a very serious level, but also that these ideas and the battle of ideas and the significance of these ideas needed to be communicated to the everyman and the everywoman. So it's one thing to go through the arguments of Keynes about things like the nature of supply and demand, or his comprehension of how you maintain what he called full employment and the political dynamics of all that and the theory that lies behind all that. So at one level, we as an institution, we deal with those questions all the time. You just have to go and look at a number of our publications, and we're constantly talking about those things. But we also think it's very important to bring the import of those debates to these wider audiences. Because while it's true, as Keynes said, that the world is ruled by little else than ideas, I think it's also fair to say that the world is influenced, at least in part, by what you might call widespread popular sentiment about any number of questions, whether those sentiments are right or whether they are wrong. Because you can be right about the ideas, you can win the intellectual argument, and in the long term, that will bear considerable fruit, or whatever is the opposite of fruit over time.
mm,
But at the same time, if you're not trying to shape that broader sentiment about the proper direction and conduct of economic policy, if you're not dealing with that, then it's going to take a lot longer and it may be even more painful when the negative effects of bad economic ideas start to have an effect. So, for example, in the 1970s, I think it's fair to say the free market side's arguments, intellectual arguments, what people like Friedman and Friedrich Hayek had predicted would happen as a consequence of the widespread embrace of neo Keynesian policy started to have an effect in the form of stagflation and other sorts of problems. But it was also the case that popular sentiment had to be educated about why some of these ideas were not, because they've been told for a long time that, yes, just let the government manage the economy with these particular tools. We won't have socialism. We'll still have something like a market economy, but it will be a managed economy. And then suddenly it doesn't start, it stops working. So there's a need to talk to these wider audiences, both in terms of preparing them for changes that need to be made, but also alerting to them to the fact that there are people who have thought seriously about these questions. And part of the challenge, of course, is that a lot of the people who are engaged in the theoretical side of things aren't particularly good at talking to wider, more popular audiences. So AIER tries to do both. We try to do the deeper, more theoretical, more analytical work, and you can read a lot of our publications on those subjects. But you'll also see AIER scholars who know all this theoretical work out there, whether it's on Fox News, on NPR, on CNBC, but also writing for any number of publications across the political spectrum, explaining these ideas to broader audiences. So we try and do both of these things at the same time, which is challenging, but nonetheless necessary if you want to win the battle of ideas.
That's right. And I think a lot of what we do as well is update the conversation. So you have ideas that Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek or others were talking about in the 70s or the 60s, and their ideas are still relevant, but the issues have shifted slightly in terms of the policy, in terms of the geopolitical dynamics, right? China was not a problem on their horizon from a national security standpoint or from a rapid economic development standpoint. And so a big part of what we do, among other things, is think through, well, what does free trade and commitments to markets look like in a world with a geopolitical rival to the United States, with a country that is not particularly respectful of intellectual property rights? What does that look like? And that's something that we're grappling with. I know you've grappled with a fair amount, that we're trying to update and apply these ideas to current issues that are going on, to our current context, if you will. The other piece, I think, of what you were saying that we're attempting to do is, it's one thing to have ideas in the abstract, but ideas have to be in people's minds and they need to be conveyed somehow. You need a messenger, people who can speak or talk about the ideas. You need some way to access them. And again, I think this is what we are really trying to do, is understanding the ideas, developing them, but really conveying them, making them accessible and attractive and clear, and going beyond the soundbite or the humorous quip, which we get a lot of on social media and on podcasts like this one. People who are good at being humorous, but maybe not particularly grounded in ideas or in theory. So perhaps we can shift here, Sam, to talk a little bit about some of the specific teams at the American Institute for Economic Research. And actually, we're going to release later episodes with members of those teams doing a deep dive in terms of the kinds of topics they cover, who's involved in researching and writing about them. But could you talk a little bit about the three major research teams that we have, the different areas that we are looking at, and why each of those areas is important, just briefly, and we'll follow up on all of those topics.
Of course, every institute likes to think it can do everything, but it can't. And so, following the principle of the division of labor, AIER made a strategic choice a number of years ago to focus on three basic areas. One is monetary economics. And that's important because monetary policy, monetary theory shapes our lives, I think, in many ways that the everyman and every woman are not necessarily completely aware of. It's also something that was very important to the founder of AIER, Colonel Harwood. He wrote and thought a great deal about the monetary side of things because he was very concerned about what was happening with monetary policy in the 1930s, but maybe even more so in the 1970s. So, at the two ends of his career, when it came to engaging in economic questions, monetary issues featured very significantly. The second area is economics and economic freedom. That is really about looking for the areas in which economic liberty is either threatened or where there are opportunities to advance it. And but also making the strong empirical case in favor of markets as the preferred alternative to interventionist measures, whether it's things like wages, whether it's things like government spending, whether it's issues of entitlements, etc. So that's a very broad priority focus area for us. And it's, if you like, the bread and butter of what we do. And a lot of the immediate things that pop up in economic policy debates fall into that particular priority focus area. And then there's the third area, which I was initially brought to AIER to head up, which is called Defending Freedom, Combating Collectivism. And this was set up because, as I think we all know, there has been an upsurge of collectivist thinking about the economy, not just on the left, but also on sections of the right these days. We were talking a little bit about free trade before. That's part of what we mean when we talk about defending freedom, combating collectivism, because I think it's fair to say that the country, or at least a good number of the leadership and thinkers on the right and on the left, have moved away from the broadly free market consensus that existed on pretty much both sides of politics to different degrees from the 1980s up until the financial crisis of 2008. We see this in issues like trade. We see it in the emergence and pushing of industrial policy on both sides of politics. We also see it with the emergence of things like the ESG movement and the way that was trying to reorientate the role of business. We also see this with things like DEI, which you've done a great deal of work on, Paul, in terms of how this was prioritizing the advancement of particular political groups and political causes over good economics, and even more so in the conduct of business in everyday life. So there's a multitude of things that fall into that particular area, because I think we're living through a time in which there has been a swing back away from what you might call more individualistic, market orientated approaches to problems and market orientated ways of thinking about opportunities towards much more explicitly collectivist sentiment. For example, both sides of politics are now, in their own different ways, talking about price controls. We've had people on the left talking about the need to freeze up interest rates when it comes to credit cards. We now have people on the right who are doing this now. Right and left are into these types of what I would call gimmicky approaches. And we had more recently a recent successful political candidate talking about the need to replace what he called rugged individualism of America with the warmth of collectivism. Anyone who's been watching matters of political economy over the past, I suppose, 10 years would know that this has been a shift that's been going on for quite some time. I'm not sure those words would have been used 10 years ago, but no one was surprised, I think, when these words were used most recently during an inaugural speech of a particular mayoral office holder. It tells you just how far things have gone, where people in his position apparently have fewer and fewer inhibitions about promoting collectivism and the collectivist economic mindset and the policies that go along with that in a way that's quite open, in which I think they would have hesitated to do not so long ago.
Yeah, and I want to follow up on that. I think part of the challenge that we face is that many of the disagreements and debates that we have are not purely or sometimes even primarily technical. That is to
Mhm.
say, if you were to talk to Mamdani's supporter or voter in New York City and you were to talk to them about rent control and explain how putting a price ceiling below the market a clearing price is going to create a shortage where a lot more people want apartments that are willing to provide them. I'm not sure how much headway you would actually make. I think they would say, well, that's interesting, but I don't really care.
Yes.
Like Mamdani is just going to do, like, the system is broken and he's going to just do all kinds of things to fix it, or I feel good about what he's going to do. That warmth of collectivism, ironically, a chilling line if you know anything about collectivism, but if you don't know anything about collectivism, he's tapping into this kind of desire for sort of solidarity, for community. There are many words that maybe seem like synonyms to collectivism, community, things like that, but it means something very different. The average supporter of Mamdani or AOC or others, they're not thinking, yes, bring in the Maoist revolution. Maybe some of them are, but I think most of them are not. Or they know relatively little about Stalin, or pick your famous collectivist dictator who murdered lots of people. But could you maybe talk about that a little bit? The challenge of reaching those kinds of folks, or why cold-headed analysis, if you will, is maybe not going to be sufficient to make the case we want to make about why we shouldn't collectivize the economy.
I think it's certainly the case that we at AIER will continue to make the theoretical and empirical arguments about these types of questions because, if you like, they provide a type of foundation for proper debate about the proper conduct of economic policy. You can't ignore the empirical dimension because the theory and the empirics tell us certain types of truths about what happens in the economy if you do one thing rather than another. That said, I think you're right. One of the weaknesses, I think, of those of us on the free market side has long been a discomfort talking about the non empirical side, the non empirical arguments for a free economy, because that takes you into questions of culture, it takes you into questions of morality, it takes you into questions of values. Those are areas that collectivists have never had any hesitation about. And I have literally had people say to me things like, yes, that may be true empirically. Yes, I understand that price controls have these negative effects, but I don't care. And the reason I don't care is because I believe in solidarity, or I
Mhm.
believe in social justice, or I believe in the brotherhood of all men and women, etc. And we have to keep in mind that human beings are not just economic beings. One of the things that makes us different, another thing that makes us different from the animals is that we have reason, we have free will, and we can know the things that we ought to be striving for if we're concerned about living in a good society. Not just a free society, but a good society to which people are inspired to live in and in which they see the market economy as part and parcel of a broader social order that takes liberty and personal responsibility very seriously because those things are good in themselves. Now, an older generation of classical liberal free market thinkers had no hesitation about engaging those types of subjects. You only need to read, for example, Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty, and the first few chapters are all about these questions of values and the nature of freedom and what we mean by words like equality and the rule of law. Wilhelm Röpke, a very famous German economist, was of a very similar mind. He wrote a whole book in which most of the argument was about the moral and cultural case for the market economy and the moral and cultural case against all forms of collectivism. I like to put it in this way: no one is going to storm the barricades for efficiency alone. They'll get excited about markets, not just if they see greater prosperity, although that's obviously part of it. There's a good to be realized through that greater prosperity, but if they have the sense that they are doing something, they're promoting a set of ideas that's materially good for human beings, but also is good for people in a moral and cultural sense as well. And that's one of the things we try and do at AIER. We do the empirical work, we do the theoretical work, but we try and integrate that into this broader normative argument in favor of free markets and limited government. Because, as I said, I think a lot of free marketers, particularly, I suppose, after the fall of communism, started focusing very heavily on the empirical side and showed a certain discomfort talking about some of these other more value orientated, more normative orientated questions. And I think if you want to win the battle of ideas, you need to win the empirical argument, but you've also got to win the moral argument as well. And the left know that. Collectivists, not just on the left, but also on the right, understand that. You only need to see that the way that the economic nationalists on the right talk about these things. They will literally say, I don't care. When you make
Mhm.
a very strong economic argument to them, I care about my country. My country is not an economy. My country has a general welfare, a type of common good that we need to care about. And if that means less economic freedom, so be it, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I don't happen to think that you need to sacrifice economic freedom very much at all if you're really concerned about the general welfare of the United States. But if you don't engage the argument at that type of level, I guarantee you will lose the argument in the wider population.
That's right. I think when it comes to trade, for example, there are many people who are protectionist who, when you really push them on it, will acknowledge, yeah, it's going to raise prices, and we're probably going to produce a little bit less if we don't have free trade. We have less specialization. But really, why do we care so much about cheap stuff? What we really care about is good jobs. What we really care about is manufacturing capacity or maintaining certain kinds of communities. And so there's a bit of a deflection there, but it's also these are things that matter. Of course, we want the United States to have good manufacturing capacity whether it's national defense or just in terms of how innovation occurs. Of course, we want communities to be strong and to thrive and to prosper and have opportunity. We want people to have meaningful jobs. Those are all good things to want. And then the question becomes, does protectionism actually promote those things or does it undermine them? That's the empirical side of it. But it requires us to think carefully about what it is that people care about and to connect the material with the things that they care about. I'm reminded of years ago, I was working at a foundation and we were doing this exercise, a big group of us, and some of us were drawing they were to draw a picture on like a big whiteboard of what picture represents or makes the case for capitalism and what picture makes the case for socialism or collectivism. And one of the capitalist teams, they drew this picture of the iPhone, right? Capitalism gets us this amazing piece of technology, and it is an amazing piece of technology. And you got the buttons and the apps and so forth. But then the collectivist socialist team, they drew this picture of a guy sleeping on a bench with newspaper covered in newspapers and no shoes. And you look at those two pictures, and which one is going to resonate with human beings more? The answer was totally obvious. We were all free market people, but the collectivist picture was far more compelling. And so we need to be thinking about that. And that's why I'm on this team. Something I care about is talking about the aesthetic dimensions, the beauty, the moral, and then the social dynamics of markets and of collectivism. And so, like I said, when Mamdani talks about the warmth of collectivism, people think solidarity, they think community, they think I'm in this with other people and this is meaningful and this is good. And many of them don't know much about history in terms of what actually happens in societies where you use political power and coercion and force to quote unquote share things, release all kinds of problems we could talk about. Another element that I found really helpful as I've thought about markets and advocating them is actually a book by former professor at Harvard named Benjamin Friedman called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. And in that book, one of the things he highlights that I think is really useful is he says, you know what? What actually seems to impact the culture and communities is not how wealthy they are in terms of like there's how much stuff they have or their level of quality of living, quality of life, but rather whether there is improvement and growth. And so what matters is not exactly how wealthy we are, but do we live in a dynamic society where there's opportunity, where there's energy, where there's hope? And there's growth. And I've thought about that when I argue for markets now, they are amazingly efficient and amazingly productive, and they give us all kinds of wonderful things. But really, what matters more, in my view, when it comes to human flourishing, is actually the change, the dynamism, the growth, the opportunity. That's what matters from the human flourishing standpoint. Of course, medicine matters and having stuff matters, but it's actually the opportunity and the forward lookingness and the ability to create and to build and to be in community with others, real community, voluntary community with others. That is what really matters from human flourishing. And I think we appreciate that. Sometimes we get lost in the weeds of why is healthcare a mess or why is whatever a mess. And those are worth talking about for sure. But I think from the standpoint of this team of combating collectivism is we want to really share what does a vibrant society look like, and economic freedom is a part of that, but why does the economic freedom matter?
There's a number of ways of thinking about that. One is that one of the things about economic freedom is it requires you to make choices and it requires you to act. It requires you to be creative. It requires you to take personal responsibility. It requires you to think about other people's wants and needs and how they can be most efficiently and effectively met. It forces you to keep asking yourself why you're doing certain things and perhaps making the decision that you're not going to keep doing a certain thing and instead you're going to change and go in another direction. In other words, there's a great deal of agency. There's a great deal of agency involved in market economies. You can't have a market economy unless people are willing to act as agents for themselves and for their families and those that they care about, but also for those untold millions of consumers that they will never know, they will never meet, but nonetheless will be impacted in some way by their economic choices. Collectivism doesn't allow you to do any of those things. Doesn't
Mhm.
encourage you to be creative unless you're a bureaucratic empire builder and you can exercise your creativity there. It asks you to hand over all your responsibility for other people to the government. It absolves you of the demands of being a free person by saying, don't worry, the state or the collective or the community will just take care of you. It doesn't really require you to be future orientated in your thinking. It's very much focused on the here and the now and things like the distribution of wealth and the here and the now. It doesn't encourage you to have a positive view of other people. It tends to view other people as cogs in a machine that's controlled from the top down. So, even beyond the material prosperity that markets offer people and do deliver to untold millions of people, this other dimension whereby markets confer agency on individuals, but also demand agency from individuals as well. It is a more reflective mirror of what human beings are meant to be. In other words, markets better reflect what you might call, to use a technical term, our anthropology, who we are as human persons. It even does things like takes the fact that we are self-interested beings, which is what one of the great things that Adam Smith talked about, but shows how markets enable us to pursue our self-interest rightly understood in ways that unintentionally benefit other individuals, that unintentionally grow the sum total of wealth in society, that unintentionally provide people with jobs and opportunities, etc. So I think markets are much more reflective of who human beings are. They're much more reflective of our nature. Collectivism violates very much all the things about human beings that make us distinct. It basically denies us free choice. It limits our creativity. It undermines our creativity. It strips us of our responsibility, etc. Which is why I think it's not just the case that people in collectivist economies have been a lot poorer than those who live in market economies. They also live a miserable life on the cultural and moral plane of existence as well. Just talk to anyone who lived under the Soviet Union or who lived under the worst parts of Mao's China, or those who were imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain for over 40 years. They can tell you about the emptiness that characterizes and in those cases where they still exist, places like North Korea, etc., how empty they are for human beings. Now, markets have their own challenges. The line between selfishness and self-interest can sometimes blend into one another. Markets orientated towards the long term, which means that people who are focused on the short term are going to be dissatisfied. As people get wealthier in free economies, that also creates the risk that some people will become envious and want to tear everyone down to the basic levels of everyone else. So it's not to say that markets don't have their own challenges. They absolutely do. But I think markets, because they reflect more closely who we are as human persons, are always going to be economically, morally, and culturally better than all the alternatives.
That was very well said, and I think we're nearing the end of our time here. I think I'll just add one quick layer here, maybe for a future episode we can talk about. In what you described, Sam, I think I find that very appealing. I resonate with agency. I resonate with our natures, with taking responsibility, with not being coddled, with not having this sort of central control and top down approach. But I think like another layer of the conversation that we are trying to have and that society needs to have is I think some people might listen to what you just said and say, the market sounds demanding.
Hmm.
You said it requires, it demands, it asks us to. And I think that's a good thing. I think we ought to be asked to do things. I think that meaning comes from having obligation and working to fulfill it with others, not in just an isolated sense. But I think some people are saying, you know what? I do want to be taken care of. I do want someone to make sure I do all right. I want this sort of safety net. I really, what if I fail? I'm afraid, or I really care a lot more about this kind of equality you referred to, as opposed to some people just doing so well that it just drives me crazy, even though they're not hurting me. And I think we got to make that case as well, that it is part of our natures to choose and to act and to build. And there is something very repressive, even for those who don't see it, something very repressive about handing over the reins to the economy to government officials and bureaucrats who, for reasons we won't go into now, will not likely exercise that power in a way that benefits the people over time.
Yes, that's definitely a challenge because there are people who, if they're asked to choose between liberty and security, a lot of people will put their hand up for security. This is a thing I often do in Europe. You ask people, okay, of the people in the room, if you have to choose between liberty and security, what do you choose? I can guarantee 9 out of 10 Western Europeans will raise their hand for security. If you ask the same question in America, it's more along the lines of 70-30. 70 in favor, 70% of people would say liberty, 30% of people would say security. So I think part of the job that we have to do as those of us who believe in economic freedom and limited government is to show people that in the end, if they really want long-term security, they should opt for the market because collectivism does not, in fact, deliver you security. It delivers you into servitude. And servitude is a very strange way of wanting to live your life if you think that you care about flourishing, if you care about things like improvement. Just economically speaking, collectivism will not deliver the degree of economic growth that you need if you're going to have a society in which most people don't have to think about the things that they need to do every day.
Excellent. Sam Gregg, thank you for joining this first episode of The Economist Next Door. Thank you all for listening. There will be more episodes like this with other folks from AIER and other scholars. We'll have often 2 or 3 guests on. So if you enjoyed this and you look forward to going a little bit deeper on some specific issues, whether it's monetary policy or housing policy or family formation or affordability, these are just a few of the topics that we have lined up over the next 4 or 5 episodes. Thank you for joining us, and I will talk to you at the next episode.